In the dust and blood of the American frontier, where survival meant choosing between pride and hunger, a young Apache girl made a choice that would echo through decades of family memory. She walked barefoot into the world of a man who had every reason to turn her away, and whispered a simple request. His response, so brutal in its honesty, so stripped of pity, became the beginning of a story that taught her what civilization really meant. This is not a story of romance or redemption through kindness. This is a story about the distance between worlds and what it cost to bridge it. The afternoon sun hung low over the New Mexico territory in 1898, painting the desert in shades of orange and blood red. Thomas Brennan had built his ranch from nothing but stubbornness and desperation, wrestling thousands of acres of unforgiving land into something that could feed cattle and, if he was lucky, himself. He was not a man known for sentiment. The men who worked for him knew this. The few people in the small settlement of San Ignacio knew this. The animals he raised knew this. Even the land seemed to know it, responding to his demands with sparse water and marginal grazing that just barely kept his operation alive. Thomas was 63 years old, weathered like wood left out in the elements for decades. His face was a map of lines, each one earned through real suffering. Heat, cold, loss, and the relentless weight of maintaining something that constantly threatened to collapse. He moved slowly now, his left knee weak from a fall years ago that had nearly killed him. But his mind was still sharp, and his hands were still strong enough to work. He didn't need much. A simple cabin, coffee, beans, the occasional beef he slaughtered himself. This was enough. The girl appeared on foot, just as the sun was sliding below the western hills. She emerged from the heat shimmer like a ghost, barefoot on the rocky ground that would have torn the feet of most people raw within minutes. Thomas was checking the fence line on the western edge of his property, one of the endless tasks that consumed his days. He saw her first as a disturbance in the dust, then as a shape, then as a young human being who had no business being out here alone. She was perhaps 16 or 17, though it was hard to say. Years of hardship can make young people look old, and she carried that hardness in her bones. Her dark eyes were set in a face that had been weathered by sun and something else, something that looked like grief. She wore what had once been a calico dress, now torn and stained beyond recognition. Her black hair hung down her back in a loose braid, and her feet left small, precise prints in the dust. Thomas did not move toward her. He did not call out. He simply watched, waiting to see what this apparition wanted. In his experience, nothing good came from unexpected visitors, and a young Indian girl appearing alone on his land at sunset was about as unexpected as things got. The girl walked closer, moving with a kind of quiet determination that suggested she had been walking for a long time and still had strength left in her legs. She stopped about 10 feet from him, respecting some invisible boundary that people understand without being taught. Her eyes met his, and Thomas saw that they were a dark brown, nearly black, and filled with something he couldn't quite identify. "I need help," she said in English. Her accent was slight, but her words were carefully chosen. She had been taught to speak properly, which surprised him. "I walked away from the reservation. I cannot go back." Thomas had lived in the territory long enough to know about the Apache reservations, the concentration camps with prettier names. He knew the conditions were brutal, that there were constant conflicts between the government officials and the people they were supposed to care for. He had seen the Apache people driven from their lands, hunted, and finally penned up like animals. He didn't think about it much. It wasn't his problem. "There's nothing here for you," he said. His voice was flat, practical. "Walk back to town. There's a mission there. They help people like you." "I will not go to the mission," the girl said. Her voice had a steel edge to it. "I was at the mission school. I learned English there, and reading and writing. Then they sent me back to the reservation because I was Apache, and I did not belong with the white children. Now the Indian agents say I think I am better than my own people because of my education. The young men do not want me because I am too proud. The families do not want me because I am a troublemaker. I cannot stay there." Thomas turned away from her and looked back at the fence, assessing the loose post with the same attention he would give to anything else that needed fixing. The girl's story was not unusual. These kinds of cultural disasters happened all the time in the territories. It was the nature of the place and the times. People got caught between worlds and fell through the cracks, and there was nothing anyone could do about it. "There is still nothing here for you," he said without turning around. "I'm an old man. I live alone. I have no use for anyone else, and I have no charity to give. Whatever you're looking for, you won't find it on this ranch." He heard her move, and he thought she was leaving. He was surprised when he heard her voice again, much closer now. She had walked around him and positioned herself so he had to see her face if he wanted to. "I work," she said. "I can cook. I can clean. I can do anything you need done. I do not need pay and money. I need a place to sleep and food to eat. I need to be left alone to think and remember who I am without men telling me I am wrong for existing." Thomas looked at her then, really looked at her. She was half-starved. He could see that now. Her collarbones were prominent, and her arms were thin as branches. Her feet were bleeding in several places, the cuts showing raw against the dust. She had walked far, and she had walked hard, but her eyes were still clear, and they still held that strange quality that he couldn't quite name. "Why should I believe you can do any of those things?" he asked. "You're a reservation girl. You've been kept in a compound. You probably don't know how to do anything practical." "I was born on this land," she said, "before the reservations. My mother was a good woman and a good teacher. She died of fever when I was small, but she taught me to cook the old foods from the old ways. I learned white cooking at the school. I can work with my hands. I am not afraid of hard work, and I need no one to care about me. I only need not to be sent back." Thomas stood there for a moment, thinking. This girl represented a problem without a solution. If he let her stay, people would talk. The settlement would assume things about their relationship. If she was found here, there might be legal consequences. The government had rules about Indians leaving their designated places, and honestly, he had built a life of solitude that required no one else. Taking in a teenage Apache girl would disrupt everything. "Where do I sleep?" he asked. The question seemed to surprise her. She blinked as if she had been holding her breath and had suddenly been allowed to exhale. "There is a storage building behind the barn," she said. It was not a question. She had already surveyed his property in her mind. "It is dry. It would be a place." "Fix the roof before the winter rains come," he said. He turned away from her and started walking back toward his house. "There's canned food in the pantry. Coffee is in the tin on the shelf. We eat at sunrise and sunset. Don't waste things. Don't steal things. And don't ever ask me to care about you. I don't care. I won't start now." He was almost to the door of his cabin before he heard her voice again, very quiet. "Thank you," she said. Thomas didn't acknowledge it. He went inside, closed the door, and sat in his chair as the light faded outside. He had just done something foolish, something that would complicate his life in ways he couldn't even predict. He couldn't explain to himself why he had done it. The girl had simply asked, and he had simply answered, and somehow that had been enough to break through his careful walls of refusal. That night, he could hear her moving around in the storage building. He heard her sweeping, the soft sound of the broom against the wooden floor. He heard the creak of the boards as she worked to assess the roof. And then, finally, he heard silence, the silence of exhaustion and sleep. Thomas lay in his own bed and wondered what he had set in motion. He was too old to change his life. He was too set in his ways to adapt to another person. And yet, he had. With 3 simple sentences, he had allowed someone else into the world he had so carefully constructed to keep everyone out. He would wonder about that moment for the rest of his life. Why he had said yes when every reasonable part of him had said no. In the years that followed, when people asked him the same question, he would never have a good answer. He would only say that the girl had asked in a way that demanded an answer, and he had given the one that was honest. Everything else followed from that moment like water finding its path downhill. In the darkness, he could hear the wind beginning to move across the desert, carrying with it the smell of coming winter. Somewhere out there in the storage building behind the barn, a young Apache girl slept for the first time in weeks, knowing where she would wake up. It was not safety. It was not comfort, but it was something. And sometimes something is enough to begin with. The first week was a test that neither of them had explicitly agreed to take, but both understood they were being measured. The girl, who introduced herself only as Sarah, the name given to her at mission school and the one she had decided to keep, moved through the ranch with quiet efficiency. She rose before dawn each morning without being asked, and Thomas would come out of his cabin to find coffee already brewing, water already heated for washing. She worked on the roof of the storage building during the day, carefully patching holes and replacing rotted wood with scraps she found in his barn. By the second week, he had quietly moved a roll of tarpaulin and some nails where she would find them. He didn't ask how she had learned carpentry. He didn't ask much of anything. Thomas had established a rhythm in his life that now accommodated her presence like a river accommodates a stone. The water flows around the obstruction without complaint, though the river itself is changed. His morning coffee came at the same time. His evening meal appeared on his small table. The cabin was swept. His laundry was washed and folded. But they existed in a state of profound separation, speaking only when necessary, never meeting eyes for more than a moment. This changed on the morning Sarah became ill. Thomas woke to a silence that was wrong. There was no sound of her moving in the storage building. There was no sound of breakfast being prepared. The morning seemed to be holding its breath. He sat in his chair, drinking the cold coffee from the night before, and waited. Sometimes people slept late. Sometimes they were just slow. But Thomas had learned to read the silences of the land, and this silence had a particular texture to it that worried him. By midday, when the meal hour passed without food appearing, he went to the storage building. He found Sarah lying on a makeshift bed she had created from blankets he had discovered rolled under his porch. She was soaked in sweat, her skin flushed with fever. Her eyes were open but unfocused, staring at something beyond the wooden ceiling of the shed. "Water?" he said. Not really a question. He had seen enough sickness in his life to recognize the signs. "When did this start?" "This morning," she said, her voice hoarse. "There is pain. Here." She touched her side, near her ribs. "And in my head. I am sorry. I will work again when it passes." Thomas went back to his cabin and returned with water and a cloth. He found the small bottle of laudanum he kept for his own bad nights and mixed drops into the water. He had no medical knowledge, but he understood that pain and fever were meant to be tolerated until they resolved themselves. He set the water where she could reach it, and the cloth where it would be useful. "Stay here," he said. "Rest. Don't worry about the work." He left before she could respond, but he found himself returning to the storage building 3 times that day, checking on her without admitting that he was checking on her. He carried food that she didn't eat. He replaced the cloth with fresh water and a cooler compress. And in the evening, when her fever seemed to spike higher and her breathing became more labored, he made a decision that surprised him. He built up the fire in his cabin and opened the door to his back room, a space he kept closed because it had belonged to a woman once, years ago, and he had never bothered to change anything in it. But it was clean, and it had a real bed instead of blankets on the ground. He went to Sarah and, without asking permission or looking at her in a way that might be misinterpreted, he carried her into that room and settled her on the bed. "You'll recover faster with proper shelter," he said. That was all the explanation he offered. For 3 days, Sarah lay in that room, and for 3 days, Thomas became something he had never expected to be. He was not a gentle caregiver. He was not the type of man who would sit holding someone's hand or speaking soft words. Instead, he was practical. He changed her dressing when the fever caused her to sweat through her clothes. He forced water and weak broth down her throat when she was lucid enough to swallow. He cleaned up after her when her stomach turned against the food. He moved through these tasks with the same efficiency he brought to all his work, neither cruel nor particularly kind, simply necessary. Sarah moved in and out of consciousness during those 3 days. Sometimes she seemed to know he was there. Other times she spoke in Apache, words Thomas didn't understand, sometimes crying out as if she were reliving things that had hurt her. He simply let her speak, offering nothing but his physical presence and the basic maintenance of her body. On the morning of the 4th day, her fever broke. Thomas, who had been dozing in a chair in the corner, woke to find her awake and aware, watching him. Her eyes were clear again, though she was weak as newborn. "How long?" she asked. 3 days, he said. He stood and stretched his back, which had stiffened from the chair. "You had an infection, possibly from a cut on your foot that you didn't tend properly. It could have killed you." "But it didn't," she said. "It wasn't a question." "No," he agreed. "It didn't, but you need to learn to take better care of yourself. Cuts get infected out here. Infections kill people. You don't survive by ignoring your body's problems." Over the next week, as Sarah recovered, something had shifted between them. It wasn't affection, exactly. Thomas wasn't capable of that kind of emotion. But it was an acknowledgement that they were now genuinely tied to each other, not just by circumstances, but by something deeper. She had entered his face, literally and figuratively. He had entered hers by keeping her alive. When she was strong enough to walk, Thomas surprised her again. He had gotten an old horse from a man in town. Not a gift, but a trade for work he had done. He taught her to ride. Not the Apache way, which he didn't know, but the way settlers rode, with saddles and measured commands. She was a fast learner, and after only a few days she could handle the horse without his guidance. "This is freedom," she said one afternoon as they rode out across his property, checking fence lines and water sources. "My people rode like this before the soldiers came and took the good horses and left us with cattle to tend on reservations." Thomas didn't respond to her words, but he began, without ever discussing it, to teach her more. He showed her which plants on the land were safe to eat and which ones would poison you. He showed her how to track an animal by its prints and how to read weather in the sky. He showed her how to repair saddles and how to identify sickness in cattle. He taught her to shoot, both rifle and revolver, though this took longer because of his own discomfort with it. An Indian woman with a gun was not something the surrounding territory would accept easily, and Thomas understood the danger. "People in town know you're here now," he said one day as they cleaned guns on his porch. "There will be questions. Some will think I'm using you. Others will think worse. When you go to get supplies with me, they'll stare at you like you're a thing, not a person. You need to be strong against that." "I was always looked at that way," Sarah said. "By the reservation agents, by the mission teachers, by my own people, who said I was too white. This is not new." But it was new to her to have someone acknowledge that it was happening, that it was unfair, and that she would need to endure it. She began to accompany Thomas to town once a week, sitting in the cart with a straight back and eyes that never flinched from the stares. The first few times, Thomas made a point of introducing her simply as someone who worked his ranch. He paid her a wage, small but real, so that she had her own money and her own dignity. By winter, when the first real snows came to the territory, Sarah had transformed the storage building into a real home. She had properly fixed the roof, and Thomas had helped her build shelves and find or make furniture. She had decorated the walls with things she had made, drawings, small woven items in patterns that looked like old Apache designs. She had established her own space that was separate from his, but intimately connected by proximity and routine. One evening, as they sat by the fire in his main cabin, the first time she had been invited to do so, Thomas found himself asking a question. "Your family," he said, "do they know where you are?" Sarah was quiet for a long moment, watching the fire. "My father is dead," she said finally. "He died at the reservation 2 years ago. Pneumonia. My mother I told you about. I had a brother, but he..." She paused. "He was taken to a government school far away. They write, but the words feel strange, like he is becoming someone else. I cannot tell him what I am doing here. He would try to make me come back, and I cannot go back." "If someone came looking for you," Thomas said, "from the government or from the reservation, I would tell you to go. I won't risk myself or my property for anyone. You understand that?" "Yes," she said. "I understand. And when that day comes, I will go. But I do not think it will come. I am no one of importance. They have forgotten me already." Thomas nodded. In his experience, she was probably right. The reservation system was too disorganized, too chaotic to keep careful track of one girl who had decided to leave. There were thousands of them, and the government only cared when they caused obvious problems. As winter deepened, Sarah became more a part of the ranch than either of them might have predicted. She could break ice on the water troughs in the morning and work alongside Thomas to move hay to the animals. She could identify sickness in the cattle before he could, having apparently learned to read animal behavior in ways he had never quite mastered. And in the evenings, she would prepare meals that tasted nothing like the simple fare he had been eating for years, foods with flavor and texture, things that made him realize how much his own cooking had been merely functional. But more than that, the silence between them had developed language. Not many words, but the kind of communication that comes from shared work and shared understanding. When he gestured toward the northern pasture, she knew what work he was suggesting. When she moved a certain way at the table, he understood that she wanted more coffee. They had built a grammar of existence that didn't require constant explanation. One night after dinner, Thomas looked across the table at her and saw not the desperate girl who had appeared on his land 6 months earlier, but a young woman who had learned who she was in the space he had given her. She was still Apache. She still carried the weight of displacement and loss. But she was also something else now. a person who had chosen her own path and was walking it with intention. "You did good work on that north fence," he said. "Thank you," she replied. "I learned from the best teacher." And for Thomas, it was enough. It had to be, because it was all he knew how to give. 3 years into Sarah's life at the ranch, a man came riding up the long road that led to Thomas's property. It was late spring, and the land was alive with growth, the desert blooming in unexpected ways after a wet winter. Sarah was in the vegetable garden she had created, something that Thomas's property had never known before. She looked up from the tomato plant she was tending and saw him immediately, the way an animal senses danger before it fully arrives. The man was federal. She could tell by his bearing and his horse, better maintained than most of the local animals. He wore the uniform of an Indian agent, though he carried no visible weapon. His face was young, somewhere in his 30s, with the kind of clean look that came from never having worked land with his hands. Thomas came out of the barn as the man was dismounting. Sarah had learned enough about him in 3 years to know that he had been watching, that he had seen the rider coming down the road even before she had. There was no surprise in his movement, only the steady approach of a man who was about to deal with something he had expected might come eventually. "Federal business?" Thomas asked. "Not a greeting, just a statement of fact." "I'm looking for information," the man said. He had a gentle voice which somehow made what was happening more ominous. "We've been tracking a girl who left the reservation 3 years ago. There are reports that she was seen heading this direction. I'm interviewing ranchers in the area." "There's no girl here," Thomas said. "Just me." The man glanced past Thomas and looked directly at Sarah, who had not moved from the garden. He had a way of looking that tried to convey kindness, but it only came across as pity. Sarah understood immediately that kindness from men like this always came with a price. "You there?" he called. "Are you Apache?" Sarah did not answer. She simply waited, her hands in the dirt, her face neither welcoming nor hostile. This was something she had learned to do. Some questions don't require answers if you refuse to acknowledge them. The man walked over to her, and Thomas followed him. Sarah could feel the tension in Thomas's body, the careful control he was maintaining to not do something violent. It was one of the things she had come to understand about him, that he was capable of great violence, and it took constant effort to keep that capability contained. "What's your name?" the man asked. "Sarah," she said. She had decided long ago that she would not give this name up, would not return to the other names that had been stripped from her. This was the one she had chosen, and it was hers. "Sarah what?" "Just Sarah," the man smiled, that unbending kindness again. "I'm Agent Morrison. I work for the Indian Service. There's a girl named Sarah who disappeared from the San Carlos reservation 3 years ago, 17 years old at the time. We have a responsibility to locate her and ensure she's been treated properly." "She's safe," Thomas said. "She works." "She's treated fairly. Better than she'd be anywhere else, I'd wager." "That may be," Morrison said, "but she's Apache. She has a family. There are people looking for her." This was a lie. Sarah knew it was a lie. Her father was dead. Her mother was dead. Her brother had been taken to schools far away and was becoming someone else in distant places. There was no family looking for her. What there was a system that could not tolerate someone who had left it, who had decided that their way of life was not the only way worth living. "I am not going back," Sarah said. Her voice was quiet, but it carried the kind of weight that comes from absolute certainty. "It's not a question of what you want," Morrison said. And now his kindness dropped away to show something harder underneath. "You're a ward of the reservation. You can't just leave. It's against the law. There are consequences for people who try to escape the system we've built to help you. Your system is a prison," Sarah said. She had learned to speak in English without any accent, a gift from mission school that had served her well.
"It is a prison that says it is for our own good. It is a prison that tells us we are not good enough to be ourselves."
"I do not want to be saved by your system." Morrison looked at her with something that might have been respect quickly covered over. He turned to Thomas. "I can make this easy, or I can make it difficult," he said. "But she has to come with me." "That's not negotiable. The law is clear. You can either hand her over, or I can come back with a marshal and charges against you for harboring a fugitive." Thomas was quiet for a long moment. Sarah could see the calculation happening in his face, the slow working through of what would cost him most: his freedom, his property, his solitude. She had known this day might come. She had prepared herself for it, though the preparation had only ever been intellectual, never truly emotional. But then Thomas did something that surprised even her. He turned to Morrison and said very quietly, "I'll pay any fine, any amount. Take it from my land value. You can have the back 40 acres if that's what it takes, but she stays." The word hung in the air, impossible and real at the same time. Morrison stared at him as if he had spoken in another language. "You can't buy your way out of this," Morrison said. "The law doesn't work that way." "Then I don't care how the law works," Thomas said. "Take me to court. Arrest me. I don't care. She stays." What happened next was not dramatic. Morrison didn't pull a gun or call for help. Instead, he simply looked at Sarah with something that might have been pity, might have been resignation. He had seen this kind of resistance before, he implied through his gaze. It never ended well. "You're making a mistake," he said to both of them. "You think you can exist outside the system. You can't. It always catches up." He returned to his horse, mounted without ceremony, and rode back down the road he had come. It was anticlimactic, which was somehow more frightening than if there had been violence. Sarah understood that he was giving them a grace period, a chance to think about their decision, and she understood that he would return, possibly with law enforcement, possibly with a larger agenda. That night, they sat in the cabin in complete silence. Sarah had expected Thomas to tell her to leave, to tell her that he had changed his mind now that he truly understood the cost, but he said nothing. He simply sat by the fire, smoking a pipe he almost never smoked, and watched the flames. "You could lose everything," Sarah said finally. "Yes," he agreed. "Why would you do that?" Thomas took a long time answering. The question seemed to require him to articulate something he had never put into words. "Because you asked for a place to sleep," he said finally, "and I told you where. That was a contract in its own way. I keep my contracts. And because in the 3 years you've been here, you've reminded me that there's a difference between living and just not dying. You gave me that back. I won't have them take it away." Sarah understood then something fundamental about Thomas that she had only partially grasped before. He was not a man capable of love in the traditional sense. He was not capable of the kind of tenderness that most people needed, but he was capable of loyalty, absolute and uncompromising, once he had given his word. She had asked, and he had answered, and that answer would stand against everything. But Sarah was also practical, as he had taught her to be. She began that night to prepare for departure. Quietly, without telling Thomas, she packed a bag with money she had saved from the wages he had paid her. She gathered the things that mattered to her, the drawings she had made, the small woven items, the letters from her brother that had come to the ranch under an assumed name. She made preparations that she knew would allow her to leave quickly if she had to, but she also made them knowing that Thomas had meant what he said. The warrant came 2 weeks later, brought by a marshal and 3 deputies. Morrison had made good on his implicit threat, but when they arrived, they found that Thomas had been to town, had found a lawyer, had filed papers showing that Sarah had been hired as a legal worker on his property, that he had paid her wages, that she was no longer technically a ward of the reservation system but a free person making her own choices. It was a legal fiction, barely holding together, but it was enough to tie the marshals up in questions they didn't have answers to. In the end, they left, frustrated and empty-handed, with instructions to Thomas to appear before a judge in the territorial capital in 3 months' time. The 3 months that followed were the strangest of both their lives. Sarah lived in constant anticipation of the next disruption, but it never came. Instead, the land moved through its seasons. Summer turned to fall. The harvest came in. The animals had to be tended, and Thomas and Sarah lived in the strange peace of people who knew they were about to lose everything and had decided to simply continue on anyway. When Thomas appeared before the judge 3 months later, he went alone. Sarah wanted to accompany him, but he refused. He went to town in his old coat, carrying the papers that his lawyer had prepared. He went into a courtroom that smelled like dust and old wood, and faced men in black robes who represented a system that had been built to destroy people like Sarah and protect people like himself. What he said in that courtroom, no one ever really knew. He didn't tell Sarah, and she didn't ask. But when he came back 3 days later, he came back alone, or at least alone in body. Something in him seemed different, diminished in some ways and strengthened in others. "It's done," he said, and would not elaborate. Later, when Sarah went to town, she understood. She had been officially registered as a free person. The legal documents existed to prove it. She was no longer the property of any system. She was simply a woman who worked for Thomas Brennan, who had hired her freely and who could no longer be forced to return to the reservation or any government institution. The change was subtle, but it was real. The way people looked at her in town shifted. Some of the stares became merely curious rather than threatening. Some of the people who had avoided Thomas now seemed to accept him as simply an old man with an unusual living arrangement rather than a criminal harboring fugitives. Years later, when researchers and historians would come asking questions about how Thomas and Sarah had lived, about whether their relationship had crossed boundaries that society deemed inappropriate, the answer always remained unclear, because Thomas would never confirm or deny anything. He simply said that he had given her a place to sleep, and she had stayed, and that was all there was to it. In a way, it was the truest answer anyone ever got. But the truth was more complex than that simple statement. It was true that Thomas never touched her in any way that a stranger would question, but it was also true that he had been changed fundamentally by her presence. He had become less certain that solitude was the best way to live. He had become less convinced that other people were nothing but complications. He had learned from a young Apache girl who had asked for very little that sometimes showing up for someone is its own form of love, and that loyalty can look like something that has no name. Sarah stayed at the ranch for 22 years. She never married. She never left, even after Thomas died, and she could have moved to a city or joined a community of her own people who had begun to organize and resist. She stayed because the ranch had become hers as much as it had been his. She had chosen it, and that choice had liberated her in ways she had never anticipated. When she was older, living alone on the land that had become her own, she would sometimes tell visitors the story of how she had arrived. She would tell them about the barefoot girl who had appeared in the dust and the old man who had asked where she wanted to sleep. She would tell them about a transaction that had seemed simple and transactional, but had turned into something that neither of them could have predicted. "He never promised me love," she would say. "He never promised me anything but honest work and a place to rest. He gave me something far more important. He gave me the right to choose my own life. That is a gift that very few people get to give, and even fewer people know how to receive." The ranch still exists today, though in different hands, its history fading into the general narrative of the frontier. But in the ledgers and documents that survive, there is evidence of Sarah's presence, the careful accounting in her handwriting, the improvements to the land that were clearly her work, the slow transformation of that brutal territory into something approaching beautiful. And in some collections of oral histories, there are still stories told by descendants of people who knew them both. Stories about an old man and a young woman who built something together that transcended the laws and limitations of their time, simply by refusing to accept what others told them was possible.